What if the one person who made you feel truly alive was someone you were never supposed to want? Samantha, a woman in her 60s, lived by routine until she met Logan, a young swim instructor who saw her in a way no one else had for years. What started as stolen glances turned into something far more dangerous. But how long can you hold onto something that was never meant to last? And at what cost? Samantha had always found solace in predictability. At 62, her life had settled into a familiar rhythm, one that gave her a sense of stability after years of raising children, managing a household, and dealing with life's endless responsibilities. Twice a week, without fail, she packed her swim bag, carefully folding her towel and swimsuit before heading to the local aquatic center. Swimming was her escape, her one moment of true peace in a world that often felt too fast and too loud. The pool had become her sanctuary. She loved the feeling of gliding through the water, her arms cutting through the cool blue as if carving out a space where time stood still. The early morning hours were her favorite, when the place was mostly empty, save for a few other swimmers lost in their own routines. The soft hum of the pool's filtration system, the gentle ripples against the tile walls, the rhythmic splash of strokes, it was the kind of quiet that soothed her soul. Samantha's body had changed over the years, but the water never judged. It didn't care about the stiffness in her joints or the faint lines on her skin. Here, she was weightless, powerful even, lost in the meditative repetition of movement. It was a ritual she had come to cherish, a part of her life she never thought would change. But then, one morning, it did. She first noticed him from a distance, a young instructor leading a group of children at the far end of the pool. He was tall, athletic, his movements fluid and effortless. There was an ease about him, the way he interacted with the kids, his voice both patient and firm. She didn't think much of it at the time. Young instructors came and went, their lives never really intersecting with hers. Later that day, as she dried her hair in the changing room, she caught a glimpse of him walking past. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and he gave her a polite nod. She returned the gesture without thinking, then turned away, dismissing the encounter as nothing more than a passing moment. The next time she came to the pool, however, she found herself noticing him again. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the way he seemed genuinely engaged with the people around him. Whatever it was, something made her pay attention. That morning, after finishing her laps, she lingered by the edge of the pool, stretching her arms, shaking out the tension in her muscles. She had no intention of starting a conversation, but before she knew it, she was walking toward him. It wasn't like her to initiate interactions with strangers, especially someone so much younger. Yet, there was something about him, an unspoken pull she couldn't quite explain. As she approached, he looked up from the equipment he was packing away. Up close, he seemed even younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, but there was an ease in his expression, a quiet confidence that made her feel seen. "You're the new instructor, aren't you?" she asked, her voice steady, though she felt an odd nervousness creep in. He nodded, flashing a warm smile. "That's right. And you're here pretty often, aren't you?" She blinked, surprised that he had noticed. "Yes," she admitted. "I've been coming here for years." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "You've got a really strong stroke," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Smooth and controlled. Have you ever thought about joining one of the adult swim classes?" She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, no. I'm not competitive at all. I just swim because I enjoy it." "That makes sense," he replied. "Still, you've got great form. Better than most." The comment caught her off guard. She wasn't used to being noticed in that way, let alone complimented. It had been a long time since anyone had acknowledged something physical about her, and she found herself holding onto his words, turning them over in her mind as she left the pool that day. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than polite conversation, but something about it lingered. The following week, their interactions became more frequent, small moments that felt insignificant on the surface, yet carried a quiet intensity beneath them. He would nod when she arrived, offer a passing comment about her technique, sometimes even swim a lap or two alongside her. Their conversations were casual, about the water, about endurance, about the sheer joy of movement, but there was an ease in their exchanges, a familiarity that seemed to grow with each passing encounter. And then came the realization, subtle but undeniable, she was looking forward to seeing him. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one that both intrigued and unsettled her. For years, she had considered this place her own, a private retreat where she could be alone with her thoughts. But now, there was something, or rather someone, pulling her out of that solitude. She told herself it was nothing. Just a friendly instructor making small talk with a regular swimmer. But deep down, she knew better. Something had shifted. And whether she was ready to admit it or not, her routine would never be the same again. Samantha had always prided herself on her ability to keep emotions in check. Life had taught her to be practical, to rely on routine, to find comfort in the things she could control. But something about her mornings at the pool was changing, and no matter how much she tried to dismiss it, she felt it in the way her pulse quickened when she stepped through those glass doors. She wasn't used to this anticipation. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing more than appreciation. After all, wasn't it nice to have someone acknowledge her effort? To be seen? To have someone, even a young instructor, notice the way she moved through the water? But the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore. Every time she arrived, he was there. Some mornings, he was busy with a class, his voice carrying across the space as he guided his students through drills. Other times, he was adjusting equipment or talking to a colleague. But no matter what, he always noticed her. A nod. A casual smile. A quiet good morning, Samantha, as she made her way to the water. And then there were the moments that lingered just a little too long. One morning, as she pulled herself from the pool, droplets cascading down her arms, he was standing nearby, leaning against the railing. He watched her for a second before speaking, his tone casual, but something about the way he said it made her pause. "You make it look effortless." She glanced at him, breath still heavy from her lapse. "It's just habit," she replied, reaching for her towel. He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You move with purpose. Most people just try to get from one side to the other." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. "You actually enjoy it." She felt something tighten in her chest, an awareness, a realization that she wasn't sure she was ready for. Over the next few weeks, their exchanges grew more frequent. Not planned, not deliberate, but inevitable in the way that two people who notice each other always seem to cross paths. He would offer tips on how to conserve energy during her strokes, subtle corrections to her form. She listened, even when she didn't need to, just for the sake of keeping the conversation going. She found herself making small adjustments, not because she wanted to improve, but because she liked the way his attention lingered on her. And then there were the laps. One morning, after finishing his own workout, he slid into the lane beside hers. She didn't acknowledge him at first, keeping her focus on the water ahead, but she knew he was there. He matched her pace, staying just behind her, his presence like a quiet challenge. By the time she reached the other end, she turned to find him treading water, a smirk playing at his lips. "You've got endurance," he said. She shook her head, trying to slow her breathing. "I've had practice." He didn't move, didn't break eye contact. "I can tell." And just like that, the air between them changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to her, it was undeniable. She wasn't imagining it. The weight in his gaze. The way his voice softened when he spoke to her. The way he seemed to position himself closer whenever they talked. It was dangerous, this feeling. And yet, she did nothing to stop it. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, confident, but never arrogant. Maybe it was the way he spoke to her, like she was someone worth listening to, worth noticing. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not with amusement, not with judgment, but with something that made her feel desirable. The thought alone was enough to unnerve her. She wasn't young. She wasn't naive. She knew how the world worked, how people looked at women like her. But none of that seemed to matter when she was near him. It had been so long since she had felt this way, alive, aware of herself in a way that had nothing to do with responsibilities or expectations. And yet, despite the warmth that bloomed in her chest every time their eyes met, there was another feeling creeping in. Doubt. What was she doing? What was she allowing to happen? She told herself it was nothing. That she was overanalyzing. That he was just friendly. That she was just another swimmer to him. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was something more. And for the first time in years, she had no idea what to do about it. Samantha had spent years perfecting the art of self-control. She knew how to keep emotions at a safe distance, how to compartmentalize feelings that had no place in her carefully structured life. But with him, Logan, those boundaries were starting to blur. She had convinced herself that their connection was nothing more than fleeting moments, casual exchanges, harmless observations. But something had shifted, something undeniable, and she felt it growing between them with each interaction. It was an evening like any other. The pool was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights casting long reflections across the water. Samantha had stayed later than usual, letting herself float in the stillness, prolonging the moment before she had to return to reality. By the time she stepped into the changing room, the air was thick with steam, the scent of chlorine clinging to her skin. She was toweling off her hair when she heard footsteps, familiar, unhurried. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. "Hey," Logan's voice was softer than usual, carrying an edge of something she couldn't quite place. Samantha hesitated before looking up. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes steady on hers. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet intensity that sent a ripple of awareness through her. "I was hoping I'd catch you before you left," he admitted, his tone careful. She swallowed, keeping her voice even. "Everything all right?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then, as if making a decision, he took a slow step forward. "I don't know," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "I just wanted to talk." She knew this wasn't about conversation. The space between them felt charged, heavier than before. It was in the way he looked at her, not as a passing acquaintance, not as just another swimmer, but as someone he saw, really saw. She should have said something, should have found a way to diffuse the moment before it unraveled into something she couldn't take back. But she didn't. Instead, she stood frozen as he reached up, his fingers brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. It was such a small gesture, yet it sent a shockwave through her, igniting something deep inside that had been dormant for too long. "You look beautiful like this," he murmured, almost as if he wasn't sure whether he should say it aloud. A slow, uncertain breath left her lips. She wasn't sure what to do with those words, wasn't sure how to process them coming from someone like him. "Logan," she started, but before she could form the thought, he took another step closer, the heat of his presence pulling her in. His hands found her shoulders, fingers grazing the damp fabric of her swimsuit. He hesitated, giving her space to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But she didn't move. Instead, she felt herself leaning into the moment, her breath unsteady as his touch sent warmth flooding through her. The rational part of her screamed at her to stop, to walk away, to remind herself that this wasn't supposed to happen, that people like her, women her age, didn't get to have moments like this. And yet, when he slid his hands down her arms, when his fingers brushed against her skin with the kind of tenderness she hadn't felt in years, all of those thoughts faded into the background. She wasn't thinking about consequences. She wasn't thinking about the difference in their ages, about what anyone would say. She was thinking about the way his breath felt against her skin. About the way her pulse pounded in her ears. About the way, for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel invisible. When his lips brushed against hers, she froze, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in sheer disbelief. And then, against all logic, she kissed him back. It wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate. It was slow, testing, as if they were both waiting for the other to change their mind. But neither of them pulled away. She felt his hand slide up to the nape of her neck, anchoring her in place as he deepened the kiss, and suddenly, everything else disappeared: the past, the future, the consequences. For this one moment, there was only this. Only him. Only the quiet, undeniable certainty that something between them had shifted forever. Samantha told herself it was just a moment. Just one stolen kiss. Just a mistake. But that wasn't the truth. Because the next time she came to the pool, Logan was there, and when he looked at her, she knew it hadn't been a mistake at all. It started subtly, glances that lingered too long, brief touches that felt anything but accidental. A quiet understanding settled between them, an unspoken agreement that neither of them was willing to break. Soon, their conversations weren't just about swimming. They were about things that felt more personal, books they had read, places they had been, regrets they carried. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and that alone was enough to unravel something inside her. And then, there were the moments when words weren't necessary at all. At first, she resisted. She told herself she wouldn't let it happen again, that she wouldn't cross that line. But every time she saw him, every time she felt his presence just a little too close, her resolve weakened. The changing room became their hiding place, a space where reality couldn't touch them. After her swims, when the pool was nearly empty, she would linger just a little longer, pretending she had nowhere to be. And Logan would find her. It was always the same. A quiet greeting. A glance that said everything. And then, the inevitable. She told herself it was harmless. That it was just physical. That she was only indulging in something temporary, something fleeting. But the truth was, it wasn't just the way he touched her that made her breathless. It was the way he looked at her. Like she was the most fascinating thing in the world. Like she was something to be admired, not overlooked. She had spent years blending into the background, becoming invisible to the world around her. But with him, she felt seen. And that was far more dangerous than anything else. As the weeks passed, their encounters grew more intense. What had started as stolen glances became something far more consuming. She didn't recognize herself in these moments. She had always been careful, measured. She had spent a lifetime making the right choices, doing the responsible thing. But with Logan, she didn't feel like the woman she had always been. She felt like someone else entirely. Someone who still had the capacity to want, to desire, to be desired in return. Yet, beneath the excitement, beneath the rush of feeling something she had thought was long gone, there was always the whisper of doubt. What was she doing? What was she allowing to happen? He was young. Too young. And she was a woman who had lived long enough to know that nothing this good lasted forever. But when he touched her, when he kissed her, when he whispered her name like it was the only thing that mattered, she let herself forget. Because for the first time in years, she felt alive. And she wasn't ready to let that go. Samantha knew it couldn't last. No matter how much she wanted to stay in the illusion, reality had a way of creeping in. Every time she left the pool, stepping out into the world beyond its walls, the weight of what they were doing settled over her. In the quiet moments alone, she wondered what he saw in her, what a man like him could possibly want with a woman twice his age. Logan never seemed to share her doubts. Whenever she hesitated, he was steady. Whenever she questioned what they were doing, he brushed the concerns away like they didn't matter. "I'm here because I want to be," he had told her one evening, his voice low, certain. "You matter to me." She wanted to believe him. And for a while, she let herself. Their secret became something sacred, something just for them. They met after her swims, in the empty spaces where no one could see. The changing room, once nothing more than a place to dry off and pack up, had become a world of its own where time stretched, where nothing existed outside of their stolen moments. It was intoxicating. The feel of his hands tracing over her skin. The way he whispered her name against her ear. The quiet, breathless intimacy that made everything else fade away. But no matter how much she wanted to stay lost in it, there was always the voice in the back of her mind reminding her this wasn't real. It couldn't be. One evening, after an especially intense encounter, she lay against the cool tile, her breathing unsteady. Logan was beside her, his fingers brushing lazily against her wrist. "I don't know how long we can keep this up," she said finally, her voice quiet. He turned to look at her, brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, this." She gestured between them. "Us." Logan exhaled, propping himself up on one elbow. "Does it have to be anything more than what it is?" She wanted to say yes. Wanted to ask him what he thought would happen in the end. But she didn't. Because deep down, she already knew. He was young. His whole life stretched out ahead of him. And she had lived long enough to know that some things, no matter how beautiful, were never meant to last. Still, she wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. So she let herself have it. One more night. One more kiss. One more moment where she let herself believe that none of it mattered. And as she lay there beside him, listening to the sound of water dripping from the ceiling, she made a silent promise to herself. She would let this go before it had the chance to break her. She just wasn't sure when she'd be strong enough to do it.